Welcome and good evening, guests, students, faculty, alumni, colleagues, and friends. Thank you all for joining us this evening for our third NYIT School of Architecture and Design lecture this fall. I am Associate Professor Naomi Frangos, and on behalf of Dean Maria Perpellini and my entire faculty, I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished guest, Ben van Berkel, followed by a discussion with Associate Professor Nader Vasugian as moderator. Our final lecture to this season, to put in your calendars, is by Monica Ponce de Leon, Dean of Princeton University and Principal of MPDL Architects, taking place here on November 28th at 6 p.m. So this fall, our series has been focused around fast-forward making praxis. Praxis is considered as a process by which layers in the expanded field of transdisciplinary knowledge are enacted, activated, and revealed. An inclusive process that moves fluidly between various scaffolds, such as material agency, computational design, theoretical framings, pedagogical laboratories, ephemeral installations, and urban networks. This series is aimed at disclosing these strong undercurrents that drive digital technology practices today, but also includes those who are forward-thinking in terms of how those practices can shape the future of design and our built environment, how we practice as practitioners, and how we define our identities through this making praxis. Tonight we will hear from Ben van Berkel, principal of UNStudio. Ben van Berkel studied architecture at the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam and at the Architectural Association in London, receiving the AA diploma with honors in 1987. In 1988, he and Caroline Boss set up an architectural practice in Amsterdam, extending their theoretical and writing projects to the practice of architecture. UNStudio presents itself as a network of specialists in architecture, urban development, and infrastructure. Current projects include the design for Doha's integrated metro network in Qatar, for a large-scale mixed-use project in Frankfurt, and the Wassel Tower in Dubai. With UNStudio, Ben realized, amongst others, the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart, the Arnhem Central Station in the Netherlands, for which he will speak on tonight, and the Raffles City mixed-use development in Hangzhou, the Canaletto Tower in London, a private villa set up in upstate New York, and the Singapore University of Technology and Design. He also conceived a vision for the future of the European Hyperloop stations as a study of urban integration, accommodating and adapting to various sites and sizes through a series of tessellating components. In 2018, Ben van Berkel founded UNSense, an architect company that designs and integrates human-centric tech solutions for the built environment. Ben van Berkel has lectured and taught at many architectural schools around the world. Currently, he holds the Kenzo Tang Visiting Professor's Chair at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, where he has led a studio on health and architecture in 2017. He also gave a TEDx presentation about health and architecture. In addition, he is a member of the Task Force Team Advisory Board for the Dutch construction industry. Currently, he's a member, and the Advisory Board Construction Industry for the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. So tonight, Ben van Berkel will speak on his exciting project, Arnhem Central Station. So now, if you would kindly silence your digital devices, please welcome Ben van Berkel.
Thank you. Thanks. So, yes. So what I will do is to start with we'll start with the Arnhem train station, and what I quite like is that we have a conversation afterwards, because I've noticed within the dialogue and maybe some questions coming from your side that certain things I might not even have mentioned in my talk, I can then answer later on, and we can set up of course a dialogue. So stretching the type, I mean by that if one designs a transfer hub, as we later call it, instead of a station, then one needs to think beyond the classical notion of traveling. And maybe you know this picture from the Mercedes-Benz Museum, but we have always had this fascination for transport and infrastructure, like in this museum, you enter the museum, and if you walk up or you take an elevator up, then the first thing you experience is as if you drive or step into a dream of the history of cars. And in this case, we had a long conversation with the client about what is a car? Is it really an object where we drive in, and is the brand you have, is that the most important to present, or is it more important to celebrate the idea of the history of the object of the car as a cultural artifact? And we went with the client to the Museum of Modern Art. In that time, I don't know if still the helicopter is hanging into the lobby, but I remember that there was a helicopter hanging in the lobby, identifying the industrial design and architecture department. And when I talked about the reference towards to art and industrial objects, we argued together that the most important is that one could say that an industrial object can also be placed in a museum. And so instead of designing a showroom for the car, what was the first idea for this project, we designed a museum. And similarly, we had discussions with the client about in Arnhem for the train station, about what is a train station, what can we do about the excitement of traveling, as we know from, as I referred to, the Grand Central. Not that I took the client from Arnhem Central to the Grand Central, but I showed them, for instance, these pictures. That traveling is having a beautiful history. That effect of leaving and departing on the one hand, and arriving and meeting your family again, and stepping into another reality. I've always celebrated a lot in the infrastructural projects we did, and that gave me also the opportunity, together with the client, to think with them about what a station can be more than only a station. And luckily enough, in the history of Holland, there was a lot of adaptability towards the way how the Iron Road, as it was called in that time, was sometimes meandering around the lands of people who were not allowing the train to go straight through the land, but then moving just around the land in order to move the first train track from Amsterdam to, I believe, Zwolle in that time. And of course, in the future of these tracks, they were straightened out, but we were quite adaptable. And adaptability was one of my arguments also towards the way how we talk to the government, because we when we do train stations in Holland, you have to imagine that you don't talk to the city alone, you talk to government owners, the province, you talk to the rail company itself, etc. But the exciting thing about the rail company was that they, in the beginning, and that was not so exciting, that they thought that the station should only be placed on this side of the rail tracks, and that the two bus stations in front of the train station would be placed a bit similarly as it was located in the beginning, like a public square was placed asymmetrical from the location. But as we argued and said, I mean, if you look at the amount of people moving from the two bus stations and the amount of people moving from the train station towards the city, that the step over here was actually much higher than people coming from the train to the city. And was it then not more important to think about a more holistic approach towards the way how people generate more the different qualities on a site, than that you only have to look at ground values? Because the discussion was always about, yeah, but we own this ground and probably we need to have shops there, and yeah, this is your ground, and maybe you have maybe no shops, but we have the shops, and then all your people would come to our shops, and you know, these kind of quick programs in train stations, they're not the most exciting, but they believed that it was very important that everything need to be located on this site. Although when we told the story to the politicians of the city, that they then, after the amount of studies we did with where and how the movement of people would need to go on the location, then luckily enough the rail people were slowly getting more fascinated in the idea that we could introduce call it an open transfer location, whereby people could wait in the central area, where everything of small and quick programs could be introduced, and where one could move from the central area wherever it was needed, from one bus station, local bus station, towards the regional bus station, the train, the bicycle parking for almost 2,000 bikes, a parking area for almost another 1,000 cars underneath the side, and that actually an integral approach would be, for that reason, much better than to have a divided role between the two, more the different infrastructural entities and the train station alone. So that gave us the idea that we could do something far more exciting on the location, that we could introduce this transfer machine, whereby we could create all these different projects from not only the two bus stations, but also the programs on the side, in such a way that everything could support each other. And you have to understand that that when the government was writing programs for developing the new stations in Holland, like not only in Arnhem but in Utrecht, Rotterdam, Amsterdam and other locations, one was hoping that would stimulate also people to use public transport in a much more optimistic way than one would do before. And maybe you know that as well, that in, let's say, the 90s, the beginning of 2000, that train stations were often in Europe seen as something of the backyard of the city, that often became negative areas within the city centers or the city areas where train stations were. So what we did was to also integrate, for that reason here, a lot of programs, introduce programs of offices, housing. I mean, they're not built here, but many housing projects were introduced later on this part of the site. Even programs for the evening and cinema on this side, and of course what I mentioned about quick shopping and quick programs around the station, and more slower programs around the site were giving the site much more liveliness during the day, but specifically during the night. What I maybe forgot to mention, that on this location in the earlier days, that if you would imagine how here you would step over from one bus station to the other without a roof, you know, everyone was always standing in the rain whenever it was raining. Or if you would come off the platform, then most of the time the platform was not protected, etc. So it never felt comfortable in the time when we had the station, what was actually far too small for its density when you were there before. So when we melted all these entities of the projects together and were getting a go from all the different parties we worked on this project, we then also said that it would be so important to think about the way how Arnhem could use this station as a new way of introducing themselves in the large network of Europe, and that with quite an interesting international set of schools they had, especially the fashion school they have in Arnhem, but many other educational systems and qualities they have within the city, that could be even further be improved by by improving also its infrastructure towards the city, the city infrastructure as well. So what else? What made it then further possible to enrich the location not only by the densification of the program. You have to imagine the site size of the location is 40,000 square meters, but the amount of program we could introduce on the site is around 160,000 square meters. So it is more a project of a quite rich section than a project what had to be developed in plan. But another aspect was that we wanted to look at the way, and we talk really here about the late 90s, when we started with planning this project. We then introduced what we called a deep planning strategy, whereby we looked at where one and how one could be active in the location, so that if you would be coming out of the train, so even with a late night train, 1 o'clock in the morning, that you would have the feeling that you would be not there, be alone, because that was also another negative aspect of the train station in the earlier days, that one felt always and unsafe and not very well connected to a form of liveliness and connectivity one can have in a train station area. So these were all the different parties involved in the development of the train station, and the segments and the phasing was connected to that. So you have to imagine that for the parking, we had the local client, we had for the transfer hall, the government was involved, but also the province, so the region, and that was also meant for all the elements related to the transfer hall. Then the offices and some of the housing projects were connected to another client. So in the end, we had close to around 12 different clients where we had to work with on such a quite complex tight site. And this is what I meant about the way how we had to develop the section of the project. The station is combined with, as I mentioned, the parking, a bus station on the one hand, and then some of the programs above. But you can understand that if you think about the different column systems we had to introduce for all these different programs, then that would never fit on top of each other. So we've invented this fee system, fee construction system, whereby daylight, air, but also moving from the car park, you could then from the car park through the fees you could walk up or use the elevator to come to the bus station or the program even above the bus station. So the fees became a kind of inclusive, constructive element in order to carry all these different programs, but also with that to introduce a quite nice wide span of close to 22 meters, whereby the fees could then become a carrier of many inclusive qualities as mentioned. And you see here a close-up of that construction. And what's quite exciting, that we could bring in quite deep into the layers of the 4 layers in the car park. We could bring in daylight. And you can imagine that this was for everyone a car park what the people of Arnhem really loved, because you see there are no columns. You feel that you are not in a car park almost, but that you are entering a lobby of a building, and one felt really luckily enough safe when one would enter this lobby of the transfer location. What was quite amazing is that although it was in the late 90s that we worked on the first parts of this project, that the city wanted to have an optimum, sustainable, close to 60% to 70% energy neutral location, whereby heat of the ground during the, of course, the winter, and the other way around, for the summer would be used for controlling the energy onto the location. And the same to be said about the waste, the separation of the waste disposal system in Arnhem. You find everywhere separated waste disposals connected to a universal system, what is then connected to one building, where all the waste is then collected on the end of the location. And this is, I can tell you that this was quite quite an enthusiastic approach of the city to introduce this integral, sustainable idea for such a quite large-scale project in Holland. It was maybe one of the first ones whereby we introduced all these integral systems in a site like this, what was normally used only in a building. So, but to come to then the transformation of all these ideas around the location, and to translate that, we used all quite advanced tools and production techniques in order to make the project quite advanced for its time. Already in the early 2000 or the end of the 90s, this is even a study of an earlier project we did here in Manhattan, related to deep planning, as we called it in that time, whereby we, like in Arnhem, we looked at user groups, as you can see here. So we looked at where students, residents, commuters, but also the people who are the workers, people who, tourists, for instance, city users, who would use the location, and then we looked not only towards the way how they would use the time in the location, but particularly how they use certain public spaces. So if you can imagine that this was the first tool whereby we analyzed different user groups and with what kind of connection of infrastructure they use in the location, we discovered so many interesting things about the way how one needs to plan a location, because you would normally start to plan top down and say, well, if you have a high-end location with a high-end ground value, then of course you place the high-end program on the high-end ground value location. But we discovered that it was far more interesting to look at people, where people move and how they move, and what kind of infrastructure they use, and what kind of public spaces they use, and where do they access the site, for instance, was for us far more exciting to look at, because we discovered that it generated a total new insight of where one would place the program on which part of the location and not, and where to create liveliness on the location or not. So this turned into a total different new way for us to plan locations than one would only do top down. And with that amount of information, that grouping of quite a lot of knowledge, you could say, we had to channel this through what we called design models in order to edit this set of data systems. I've always believed that one needs to discipline a certain amount of data systems, or the way how you deal with information. In order to discipline it, one can then also collect and edit the data and give it a direction. Like what we did with, for instance, the V-walls through the section of the project, we introduced this landscape approach in the central transfer hall with these cuts because there is a slope on the side of close to 7 meters, and you know every Dutchman is happy with every little hill because we don't have hills, almost no hills. So we used the advancements of the slope and were able to open these cuts. The idea of the climb bottle principle was coming from the way how we could move this idea of how people could be attracted to move into the station, but that this kind of service bringing the people into the station could be pulled back onto itself to articulate the skin and the inner service in one gesture, in one go. And then the twist was introduced as a one column system in order to collapse all the columns into one element, carrying the whole cantilever, two cantilevered roof in the transfer location. So in that time, design models were used in order to structure information, to edit information, but also they were used in order to cross-combine knowledge and to direct knowledge in the right direction. And maybe you know this book, but I don't want to talk about the book, but specifically about the way how in that time also, and it was a bit later than 2000, but there's a book what we started to produce in 2012 and finished 3 years later, 4 years later. But dealt with the way how knowledge can be transformed in these tools where I talked about earlier, but then particularly also connected to the knowledge platforms we set it up in UNStudio later. The knowledge platforms dealt with the principles of the not only of the design models particularly, but also how these design models became big details or principles of elements we guided this knowledge through in these different platforms, from the smart parametric platform to the innovative material platform, and specifically related also to the innovative organizational platform. And this is what the top platform is actually for us one of the most important aspects of the way how you guide knowledge, because in the end you need to always find for each hybrid program, like we had on this side, for instance in Arnhem 2, you need to find an organization. But to come to an organization was our argument, was that you need to do a lot of research and a lot of testing, and there we wanted to be as innovative as possible, because that would give the architecture in total hopefully a new insight and approach towards the way how it would be articulated and be finished later on. And lately we even bring that much further into the argument of how from sensor technology to data, big data, etc., how that can be connected towards the way how we design our environments and even self-learning environments, because we know that today that through data and sensor technology one can start to rethink an environment whereby we can learn from the environment, and how through a certain flexibility of design we can then turn that also in the way how that can be implemented in design as well. Although this is an aspect of our work what is a latest development, I'm going probably not to talk about it too much later on, but maybe we can bring it into the discussion later on. But let me go back to these earlier studies of how data and digital tools were combined with the physical articulation of the way how it could be turned into an architecture. Like these studies were what we called channeling studies of how and where people would move from one part of the location. Here's the train station, for instance, or the platform location, and one would move through this side towards the regional bus. This is the local bus station, the regional bus station. On this side you have the entrance to the parking, and this is the movement towards the city, and actually this movement is a bridge going through the central hall towards a program square on the higher level, and then bringing you up to the buildings, the skyscrapers you've seen next to this station. And what you have to imagine, what we did here, we looked at the amount of people, so we really took the data of the amount of people and channeled in, gave them a service structure whereby you would actually see through these channels where you would walk. So that the articulation of the views was connected to its wayfinding, and that you would circulate in a way, or I don't know a better word for that, the views around you towards the way where you look at and where and how you need to move. To go back, maybe a slide again. What is very important, what we discovered in this study, is that we found in this particular area no movement, or almost no movement, and that's the reason why we, for instance, introduced here the twist, the one column structure, so that all these areas, the other areas where people would move from one part to the other, would have the opportunity to have no visual obstacles, as you can see here. So you would have always very open, transparent views towards the program square I mentioned on the high level, the transfer hall, the entrance towards the train station. You have on this side here the entrance towards the parking, and if you walk more down here, you have the entrance towards the parking area. And another aspect was that of course we needed to make that idea of a one column system in the whole workable, and in that time working with Cecil Belmont and the whole team around him in London, we worked on this idea of the Cipher service. Actually an idea what came out of many other studies we had done around the Möbius house, but also later on in the Mercedes-Benz Museum, how double curved surfaces could carry around specifically the edges, and we also know this of the work of Otto, for instance, that the edges could carry more weight than the surface itself. And that is literally what is happening in the twist, that the twist is carrying around its edges the power of the cantilevers instead of the column itself. And this was for me a full discovery, because I always thought that that a linear column could carry the most, but later on I discovered that a twisting column like this with a ciphered surface could carry much more weight than a vertical column system. And with this one column system we could take away in the central hall close to 60 columns we otherwise had to place and spread over the whole transfer hall, what we didn't have to do luckily enough. And of course then we needed to translate it into in a built form, and also tried very hard to make openings so that the daylight would come also around the twist down towards even the bicycle parking, and that of course that you would all the time when you would move around the twist, that the twist would move with you and in such a direction that the views and the wayfinding perspectives would actually move around the column with you. And then of course with an enormous amount of research work we did, We had in the beginning an idea that it would be possible to build a project in concrete, but then after many discussions with contractors, we came to steel because we could make the structure as slender and as coherent as we had in mind, like we did actually also with the Erasmus Bridge. The Erasmus Bridge was originally also built, planned to be built in concrete, but then the construction became too fat and too bulky, like in the Arnhem train station, and mentioned also that we could not do the slenderness, as what you can maybe see in this image. We could not introduce it as slender as we had originally had it in mind for the construction. So we built the transfer hall with a shipbuilder who did all the steelwork in segments and what was in prefab elements brought to the site and then melted together onto the site. This lady's lost actually with the bike because she normally would go down and then go to the entrance of the bike parking, but it's allowed, of course, to wherever you like to move with your bike in hands, of course, through the station. And this is the bridge moving up to the higher square connected to all the programs. And this image is maybe a strange image because it's a panorama image of the station when you come from the bus station, the local bus station, while you move towards the entrance of the train station. You see here also the daylight openings in order to articulate the entrance areas of the different programs. This is the zone where you walk to the parking entrance, and this is a small bridge construction what brings you from the city towards the entrance of the train station. And this link is made to, while you move from this part up of this bridge, this is a shortcut to bring you to the buildings on top of the station. And as I mentioned, on these locations you have these daylight openings and areas where you could actually then articulate there where it maybe gives also the opportunity to guide you and orient yourself in this space and supports wayfinding. But during the years, because we had such a long time to construct this project, not because it was difficult to build, but it was such a big project. We had so many different programs on the side. We did everything bit by bit. Like we started with the parking, then the towers were built, and then later on even the buildings on top of the parking area were built. On top of the bus station, and then the transfer hall was one of the last parts of the project to be built. We had in the meantime built so many other projects where we tested these double curved surfaces, like what I mentioned about a double curved concrete project where we had big difficulties with casting the concrete, whereby in this case in Graz, the music theater in Graz, where we discovered that it was so difficult to pour the concrete top down. We pushed it up. We pushed the concrete up in order to have not too many gravel into the concrete edges. This is Mercedes. This was actually a bit later, of course, than the train station, but was finished in 2006. But still could test some of these ideas of the ciphered surface qualities we introduced also in the train station, and for instance also in this house we played similarly with these double curved surfaces in order to test these prototypes and bring them into a series of research qualities whereby you could say that the serial of these bigger details who were tested in these projects were being improved over the time when we came to building the train station. And of course, tools became far more advanced further on into the project because as we know now we work all with BIM, and the most advanced programs to be connected to BIM as we do, because we know that BIM technology doesn't or Revit doesn't give you always the opportunity to make complex double curved surfaces. But as what we have learned, we add our own programs and develop our own programs around the tools we are working with in order to advance the crafting of the tools where we work with. And then we tested these ideas over the years in many other projects, like in the Raffles project, the Raffles project, where we have a double curved surface, but also quite a series of complex elements who came out of a program what we developed ourselves, and then for instance in Raffles we took 10 years to build this project. Now in the latest project what we are already on bringing on the construction in Dubai, we have a 6 years construction, but even with the latest project we have designed for this tower in Melbourne, we plan to have a construction time and design time of only 4 years altogether. But that means that the tools giving you, and specifically the production tools, giving you opportunities to be quicker. And that's not maybe the most important, that we are more efficient and more advanced. But the most important aspect for us is that if you can prove that you can be far more effective in the production and in the design phases, that we have learned that you can then improve the quality of time and space you create for design and research, particularly on a project. So you make more time around the project, and you can, if you save money, is what we argue with the client, then you can also, with that, make more time for these bigger details where I talked about, and spend your money on the right place in the right areas of the building. Like sustainable topics where I talked about earlier on. But of course, what I'd like to mention in stretching up not only the type and stretching up all these tools, it's also that you stretch up the realm of within the way how we work within the profession, and that's I've always been interested in that of course that I'm not only talking about buildings alone and the way how we use tools, but I'm lucky enough, maybe because of my own teaching and the writings we do, I always like to reflect on what we can discover within our profession. Like within this quote, Graham Harman says that if we think about the object, or he calls it in this case the table, it's not the electric charges rushing through the table, but it's also not the practical aspect of what we use on the table alone. So maybe you can compare the two using digital tools. When you design, it's maybe it means also the molecules moving through the object of a table. And I mentioned maybe here that what is done with all this data in the way how we formulate objects. It's not that what is the most interesting aspect of the table, but he calls it the third table, the table you can maybe not fully explain, and that is maybe what I'd like to call the cultural edge you'd like to give to the project. Something what is going beyond the making of the project in itself, because it's not that it is the most fascinating aspect of the profession, of course, the tools we use, but it is the final effect and the layers of the effects you bring to the people who are using these spaces and objects. So I've always liked that idea of the third table as a cultural reference to its how one can see architecture today. So then a transfer location needs to be more than that. It needs to be also an uplifting space, like I said in the beginning. It needs to be a place where you like to come back to. That it's maybe also in theater, where you enjoy to meet people, where you like to wait, where you like to be arriving, and where you like to say goodbye to your friends, and that it is a place for people, that it is a place where you, if you like it or not, be photographed or not, but that it is of course attracting people, but that it also gives the opportunity that these people take over the design. That is actually for me the most important. That of course then in the end it is not anymore your project. It is the project for anyone else to enjoy the project who ever comes there. And the most extremist example is, for instance, this gentleman who once made a tattoo of the Erasmus Bridge on the back of himself. This is actually a ship owner who, with his boat, as a fisherman, passes by every day the bridge, and he felt so much at home when he saw this bridge every time when he was safely going home, that he believed so much that this bridge was helping him with that, that he did this, and of course, I mean, you could be very proud of that someone is doing that, but at the same time, I like it that people then make a kind of construct themselves from a project towards themselves when they enjoy a project like that. So we didn't want to make a space for people what is chaotic, but what is uplifting, as I mentioned. Like maybe comparable to a train station, like the Waterloo station. This is in 1984, I think. Yes, where the station can be seen as a kind of little holistic world. Like maybe in this train station, it is used by so many other people than only the city owners itself. I mean, it's used for events, theatrical performances, fashion shows are be given here. So that's what we always have enjoyed when we came back to the project. Thank you very much.
Should we sit down?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this inspiring conversation. This is a real honor for me because I've been an admirer of your work for a very long time, and I think Dutch architecture, the Dutch architecture culture of the last 25 years has been a principal referent for my own thinking about architecture culture. When you started out, I have maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then I thought we can open it up for discussion. My first question is this: when you started out on this project, it was around 1997?
Yes.
So when you started on the project, the euro wasn't even in use. And when you ended the project, it was. A lot of things changed, both in the Netherlands and in Europe at large. How did how did the EU transform the way you think about your project? Because of course you're both responding to Arnhem and its needs, but also having to confront what's going on in Europe at large. I mean, it's only a few miles away from the German border.
Don't forget that in that time there was already a discussion about where and how these public projects could be finding its sponsors, and I remember that even I had to go there with some of the politicians to Brussels to talk about the project. So interesting enough, the euro was not there, but Brussels was already fully involved in these type of European projects who could support sustainable transportations was already called in that time. That was quite nice. That one saw this as a sustainable project because it was taking away the density on the road of cars, and by upgrading all these train stations, especially the areas around the train station, one needed more money in especially the city in Arnhem, who had not so much funding for this project than let's say a city like Rotterdam or Amsterdam, where they similarly improved these stations. So that's maybe not a full answer, but don't forget that Holland always thinks a lot about how it is connected to its other worlds. We like it that we can step in a train in Amsterdam and then move to Paris, for instance, in 3 hours. You know, we find it exciting, and similarly to Frankfurt, for instance, that's 3.5 hours. So Europe was always, or Europe is always you know, it's not. We don't see Europe or ourselves as a place where we are somewhere on the edge of, but we feel often that we are in the middle of Europe. And through the connection of maybe Schiphol as one of the biggest airports, or you know, one of after Frankfurt, I believe, one of the biggest airports, and Heathrow in Europe, we quite ambitious on that level to be well connected.
I guess part of what I was thinking along those lines is that there are cases when, you know, specifications that might be in play in the Netherlands might be in conflict with those in Germany or in Europe at large. You know, what a barrier-free space might mean in one national setting might not be the case in another. Did that ever become an issue for you?
No, that can become more an issue when we became more international as an office.
I see.
Like, you know, I mean, you can imagine that but it's a good question, because I mean, we of course we were heavily confronted with that when we were building for the first time in Germany. Because in Germany the lead architect on top of everyone else, engineers and all the other parties, what everyone would think is the most exciting aspect of maybe the profession, because then you can control the whole process, but it takes an incredible responsibility, what I never had before. Mercedes-Benz, for instance, or similarly, we've discovered that in other places where regulations are total, like Singapore, where we did a lot of work, the regulations are so positively, but at the same time tough there, that it took us a long time to get into all the regulations. But I wish that I had the time to write a book about all the international regulations, because I wish that they could come to one kind of international regulation system, what I could use maybe on all the locations, because in a way I've learned also from all these regulations, you know, in a positive way, like I said.
It's fascinating. A second question I have has to do with the generic in architecture. You know, back in the late 90s, Rem Koolhaas wrote a great deal about the generic, and for him, the airport was the kind of prototypical generic space that I think he believed to be in some ways emblematic of where things were going. Can you talk about the generic in relation to the train station? I mean, it seems to me that you might be critical of Rem Koolhaas on this account?
Well, I'm critical, maybe not, but I mean, we have clearly different view. I mean, he has this idea of the generic, maybe related to his often modernist interest. You know, he's interested in that type of strategies. But for me, that would never work because I see, for instance, an airport more. You know, I find it so fascinating that you could see an airport in a way as a highly functional generic system, but on the other hand, I see it also as a place of cultural. I see so many cultural effects also in an airport, like like how I talk about maybe the train station, where I celebrate this idea of traveling, and especially in an airport where you know you have a lounge and a shopping and a waiting area all combined in one. I find airports, I often call them somewhere that, you know, in a way I find that architecture falls somewhere between art and airports. You know, in a sense of, you know, the highly efficient, expanded world of perfection of the generic, but on the other hand you have art, what is not the non-predictive, totally intuitive, undescribable worlds of effects, what you hopefully can combine in architecture. So like for instance in the Arnhem train station, the generic is to be found in this idea of this story of the bigger detail. You know, the way how this testing and this melting of ideas who were not always maybe so successful in other projects, I try to make maybe in other projects more successful, like you know, the way how we dealt with double curved surfaces, etc. And construction and program around it, etc.
You know, speaking of the double curved surfaces, how do you get approval for that stuff?
Yeah, this is difficult.
I mean, yeah.
But it is. Don't forget that if you could convince, that's what I meant about being quicker. For instance, I mean, everyone who hears me talking about if we can be quick in the production of architecture, they think, oh God, that's commercial. But I don't think it is commercial at all, because the exciting thing about the way how you can improve quickness in architecture is that you could actually make more arguments in space for other things you would otherwise not be able to do. And that's the same for the double curved surfaces in architecture. If we introduce these ideas, but we tell the client, listen, but you know, for that reason you don't need these 80 or 60 columns in the central space. You have much more open view. People will feel safer. And I mean, these arguments are.
But it's a fascinating point you make. And you know, when I ask my colleagues, especially in Germany, which I know best, why so much generic architecture, the answer I get is because we don't want to get sued.
Yeah, that's, I understand.
You know, when you do experimental work, you also assume a lot of risk, legal and financial. How do you deal with that in the context of your own practice?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I mean it's true that of course I've luckily enough never been sued. I mean, is there somewhere would I might have, but the way how I do it is often related to that these two worlds between art and airport, you know, that on the one hand to be highly efficient and be effective, and to come up with a real highly professional arguments on one hand, and on the other hand to argue also that you can create with certain, maybe a bit more complexer gestures, that you create far more value, and then you get your parties on board. If you can, that's maybe the argument. If everyone is on board, if your engineers, if your client, and even their lawyers are on board, you can imagine with Mercedes, there was so much pressure on that project. We needed to finish it in, I think, 4 years' time. In 2006 it needed to be finished because the World Cup was going to happen in Germany. We built it so fast, but the client was so determined with us. Every week we had to be in Stuttgart on a Friday afternoon, and if we would have not solved all the questions he had from 2 o'clock till 6 o'clock we had in that time, then we would spend the night onwards in order to solve all the problems. And if it was not really finished, then we had to stay overnight and then stay Saturday morning. That's how you come to maybe fully integral agreements with even complex structures. But then you have to make everyone enthusiastic, and maybe that's maybe the most important aspect of an architect. To motivate everyone to go into that direction is maybe as important as being a good designer, maybe.
That's powerful. We'd love to hear from you all. Questions from our audience? Yes?
I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the site's history. If I'm not mistaken, Arnhem was quite severely damaged during the Second World War, especially in 1944, I think. And was this project trying to rectify some lingering effects of that? Was it an urban renewal scheme? Was it a straightforward transportation replacement? Was there a previous station on the site? You mentioned lots of different programs. I'm assuming you had different stakeholders, Netherlands, state railways, the city, so on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, good question. Yeah, I never go so deep, sorry for that, but they're into the site. But yes, there was a station there before. It was built after the war, actually. And of course, something of that history of the war was part of what was in my mind, similarly like what was in the mind when I designed the Erasmus Bridge, because the Erasmus Bridge celebrates also that we called it in Holland the wederopbouw, the way how, would you know how to translate?
Opbouw?
Yeah, the wederopbouw. The wederopbouw means that after the war there was a reconstruction of the war, and it was a kind of movement almost. And the Erasmus Bridge, the Erasmus Bridge was always seen as one of the last projects of the wederopbouw.
Wow.
In
Rotterdam.
Rotterdam. Yeah, but Arnhem, I had something to do with that as well, because talking about the celebration of the city and its landscape features, because I maybe know Arnhem, it's surrounded by a beautiful landscape, and even if you go up to the back of the station, then you have a park, what is called the Sonsbeek Park, that is quite hilly, and you can even, if you're on the top of the hill of the park, then you can look on top of the station. So all these ideas were related to the way how I dealt with that slope, as I mentioned. Maybe another aspect was that the city itself wanted also badly something what was far more positive to be found on that side than honestly it was a very bad station. It didn't work anymore. It was, like I said, it was not roofed on many parts, and it was far too small for the amount of people moving through that station in the late 80s and 90s. So there was a desperate need to reconstruct that whole area. But sorry for that. But it is, But Arnhem, of course, is having that optimism. luckily enough, also like Rotterdam, to set themselves on the map again, and the station for them helped with that. So for that reason maybe also the support we got.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, Giovanni?
Hi.
Oh.
Thank you for your great presentation. Several years ago, l'Architecture d'aujourd'hui published an issue named called Question de Forme. And they were trying to contrast this upcoming approach to a certain approach to architecture, a certain style of architecture as a formless. And they were saying that it's not formless, but they were kind of retracing the legacy of this approach, and a lot of the experimentation at the beginning of the 1900s with Mendelssohn, Fürsterling, not in their buildings, but more in their sketches, I would say, their drawings. And it's interesting because I can see a lot of those sketches of Fürsterling and Taut and Mendelssohn in your interior spaces. And in their description of their spaces, they start from the feeling of the human being walking through those spaces. They were writing about, I don't want to see vertical walls, it's a continuous surface, and you were talking about how this experiment and this abstract collection of data have to then land in a space that has the power of stimulating effects. What are the effects on human being? So it's not a question, it's more if you can elaborate on that. Do you have in your mind, in the back of your mind, the legacy of these experiments from the beginning of the 1900s in this?
Yes, of course. I mean, yes. But I never tell all my secrets. But no, sorry, that's not true. But of course, if you go back to the Situationists, or even go back to the Smithsons or Aldo van Eyck or the work of Hetzberger, they all talked a lot about the interaction between people and how we could make architecture social, sustainable, and to make architecture more human-centric. And of course, that was an ambition of the modernists too, actually. But interesting enough, even in France, with architects like what's his name, Perret, with his architecture oblique ideas, and Bloch, Perron, sorry, with Virilio, was Perron and Virilio together. They came up with this idea of the architecture oblique. All these histories are to be found in of course in our work. But what is interesting is that in that time, of course, they didn't have the data. If they could say, we'd like to have that amount of people connecting with each other, or they would talk about the way how in a situation like the Situationists, they were, for instance, following people in the street. Actually, I did that myself too, as a student. When I studied the work of the Situationists in my first year at the AA, I followed endlessly people in the street, just to discover where they would go, and which kind of stations they would go in and out. Because then I discovered, hey, maybe the city exists only out of crossing points. So the stations are the most important public moments in the city than maybe any other square. So of course, I mean, yes. But to link it towards to the history of form making, I'm not so fascinated in alone, as you hopefully can understand, because often I'm more interested in that idea of how you can find a public construct, and out of that public construct you translate it then into an organizational model, and then the form, and hopefully the form falls then in its place. It's not so that I'm a formalist in that sense. I'm hopefully go beyond that. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was really great to see, finally in retrospect, the project presented.
Yeah.
My question sort of is about design intelligence, which you presented the various ways that the practice of UNStudio works as an intelligent practice across projects and tools and operations, about the intelligence embedded of information of computational tools, and also how the physicality of the architecture operates as this kind of intelligent network. But you hinted at the UNSense and
Yes.
the embedding of smart systems into objects, devices, gadgets, spaces, etc. And I'm wondering, with those interests today and those technologies available, how would you have designed, possibly if you started the project, say in 2018, not in 20 years ago or so, how would those sorts of smart systems, how would you see them embedding and augmenting the kind of spaces of intelligence that you've
Yeah,
put
that's a
into
good
the
question.
intelligence?
I had the second part of my talk, but I decided not to go into it because I prefer more a dialogue like this. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm in the middle of that because I, through that enthusiasm of the tools we, as you have been a part of in your own teaching and research you did, is that that of course now what is the most exciting aspect of today's development of what we can do with computational techniques is that we can now work with data and big data and that we can program. You know, I often say that if you look to the building industry, or if we look at ourselves, let's start with ourselves. We might be in the iPhone phase, but the building industry is still in the Walkman phase, I say. And if you think about the phone and everything we can connect to that phone, then I'm quite surprised that we talk to Siemens and all these other parties who can make your building smarter with all these gadgets. But it makes me quite angry lately because then you get automized systems like maybe everything. While you move through a building, then things go automatically, etc. But it is all dealing with efficiency alone, like I said earlier on. But I think that one, as an architect, should learn to design and direct these data and give them more meaning. And that is what I hope to do with UNSense. But it is a total different company. I set it up, and it's too early to promise too much here. But in my positive angriness, I hope with this company, with the programmers and futurologen who work in that company, and programmers I have there, that we can start to work with all these self-learning environments where we can deal with today, that we can give it much more direction than let's say making buildings only smarter. I hope to make them more intelligent and maybe, for instance, more healthy. In Harvard, what was nice that was mentioned is that over the last 6 years I've done research there related to indoor health, for instance. How do we deal with indoor environments? And I'm shocked that we don't talk about the quality of the life we have in indoors, in indoor environment. While we talk so much about our planet and the sustainability of our planet, and of course what is highly necessary to improve the world around us, but why don't we talk about our indoor environment? I mean, we spend 70 to 80% of our time indoors, and if you would know how bad the air is, sorry to say that, but in every American building, or light what comes into a building, or the qualities of the materials where we are dealing with, then I think there is so much to be done on the level of how with data and sensors you can measure these things. and you can improve them, and you can upgrade them. I've already with one building, like, for instance, one building in Groningen, maybe you know it, it's a building luckily enough was a very nice client. They gave us the opportunity to use air systems, what we transported out of the operation room in hospitals, like where air is moving vertically from the floor out into the ceiling, so that the bacteria would not move from one person to the other person. And in a space like this, I immediately feel it. Air rolls through the space, so that means that the bacteria move from person to person, and that's why you get so many sick leave in office environments, for instance, or especially schools. But in this building, we have proven that we could reduce down 20% of sick leave after 3 years among the people who work there. So I believe that it is for that reason so interesting to use these new technologies for better reasons than only make them more efficient. But how that would have an effect on how the design or the architecture will look like after improving these things in the built environment, I don't know. I can honestly tell you, I don't know, because I'm in the middle of it. I'm in the middle of the research phase, and it's maybe so that I'm talking more about the invisible aspects yet of the architecture, like air, light, and acoustics. But although we are now doing research on materials, and you also don't want to know for instance, if concrete is not dried out, let's say long enough, I mean, also you don't want to know the effects for your health as well as there. So I'm learning there a lot, and UNSense is going to hopefully, like I said, I cannot fully promise, but hopefully improve all these qualities in our built environment if we can.
I think we have time for
Maybe one more question from a student who's super inspired.
Yes, I'd like to ask your opinion on a question. And essentially, kind of trying to take everything that we've just spoken about in this discussion, because I believe questions about context and history came up, as well as your comments of the interior space as well as the exterior. So essentially, I want to ask you, as a professional that's working currently, what advice would you be able to give us, or what is your, like I mentioned before, opinion on if we should respectfully reject history and context and rather embrace this sense of designing based on data and designing based on trying to create, essentially not how you were saying, not being formalists, but creating forms based on more advanced techniques?
I can understand that you can't answer, because that first question who came along was hinting at where is your context, but no, I don't think that one should really definitely still, that's the beauty of our profession, I think, and that's what I want to embrace, not only for you, but I do that all the time for myself too. Embrace the beauty of the expansion of our profession. That if you would learn more from how data can generate a particular kind of self-learning aspect of the way how you can improve the environment, then that would actually have definitely also an effect on the way how you would look differently to a location, or like what I said about indoor environments before. So don't forget how whenever you can enrich the knowledge of the profession, then you can also on the hardware side, call it maybe that way, then you can enrich it even more there as well. So yes, of course, context, materials, geometry, to still draw by hand and to do all the analog aspects of the profession are as important and will become even more important if you expand on the other side too. So I mean, it's about stretching up the profession, not in one direction, but in always as many directions as possible.
Can I ask just one follow-up question? You know, I know that Caroline Bose is an architectural historian by training. Has she been able to bring that expertise? In what ways has she brought that expertise to bear on the work of your office?
Oh, a lot. She's maybe that art aspect of the art and airports world. I mean, she is really the key founder of UNStudio and everything we do. But what nobody knows is that she later on also studied urban design, of planologie, as we say, call it in Holland. And she's also interested in the urban aspects of her work. So no, she's very important. Also, she's not someone who's so much on the foreground, but although she lectures and she teaches, but she's also the more important writer of UNStudio, a much better writer than I am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.